In the bright, echoing hangar, Technician Rowan Hale set a steel ruler against the edge of the wing and pointed to a 2-inch gap in the calibration mark. CEO Victoria Ashbourne laughed out loud, calling it the fear of a washed-up maintenance man, then ordered the warning erased so the handover ceremony could proceed on schedule. Rowan did not argue. He photographed the red mark, signed the inspection log with his own name, and walked out of the hangar without another word. 6 hours later, a pilot reported an abnormal response from the wing slats. By midnight, 200 aircraft were grounded on federal order. Before the secret behind those 2 inches gets buried for good, tap subscribe now so you never miss this breathtaking reversal of power unfolding right here. The story had actually begun earlier that morning, hours before the cameras arrived, in the vast assembly hangar of Ashbourne Aeronautics outside Wichita, Kansas, where banners the size of billboards proclaimed Victoria Ashbourne as the woman who had redefined the future of flight. The company was preparing to deliver its 600th Vantage aircraft, an occasion large enough to draw airline executives, board members, and a small army of reporters. While the communications team rehearsed camera angles near the podium, Rowan moved quietly beneath the aircraft, running through the same inspection routine he performed on every airframe that passed through his hands. It was a small scuff mark on a linkage pin that first caught his attention. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would have paused for. But scuff marks had a way of telling stories to people who knew how to read them, and Rowan had spent enough years reading metal to trust his instincts. He traced the linkage back to the calibration line, took out the same battered steel ruler he had carried for years, and measured the gap between the red reference mark and its fixed anchor point. 2 inches exactly, 50 8/10 millimeters, a number that would have meant nothing to most people standing in that hangar and everything to the handful who understood what sat behind it. A younger technician nearby shrugged it off, noting that 2 inches was nothing on a wing that stretched dozens of feet from root to tip. Rowan explained, without raising his voice, that the danger was never about the length of the wing. It was about the constant strain placed on the actuator beneath the surface, a strain the onboard computer would quietly compensate for until the day it no longer could. He knelt beside the landing gear and traced his finger along the actuator housing, feeling for the faint warmth that told him the system had already been working harder than it should. The younger technician watched him with a mixture of curiosity and doubt, unused to seeing anyone treat a routine inspection with this kind of care on a morning already crowded with cameras and banners. Rowan clipped a red no-fly tag to the aircraft and refused to sign the release paperwork despite pressure from the shift supervisor, who reminded him the plane was scheduled to roll out in front of cameras within the hour. He answered only that a signature was a promise, and he did not make promises about machines he had not fully verified. Digging through the production records at a dusty terminal near the tool crib, Rowan discovered the culprit, a calibration fixture identified as Unit J-17, which had been used on every aircraft assembled in the last several production runs. The fixture itself looked unremarkable, a simple steel jig meant to hold the actuator mount in place while it was bolted to the wing spar, the kind of tool nobody thought twice about once it passed its initial certification. But certification meant nothing if the fixture itself had drifted out of tolerance over months of repeated use, and Rowan suspected that was exactly what had happened. When he checked the full manifest, his stomach tightened. The same fixture had been used on 200 aircraft, spanning serial numbers 401 through 600, each one a potential repeat of the exact flaw sitting in front of him now. He printed the list and folded it into his jacket pocket beside his ruler, the paper suddenly feeling heavier than it should. A text from his daughter Tessa flashed across his phone, asking if he would still be able to call her that evening the way he always did on Sundays. He replied simply that he had run into a problem that was small in size but enormous in consequence, then turned back to the manifest, staring at 200 serial numbers that suddenly felt like 200 warnings nobody had listened to yet. Victoria Ashbourne arrived in the hangar, flanked by Graham Lockridge and a cluster of board members, trailed by a camera crew, eager for footage before the formal ceremony began. She spotted the red tag hanging from the nose gear and asked, with the practiced calm of someone used to controlling every room she entered, what exactly had happened. Graham introduced Rowan as a contract technician, a phrase chosen carefully to strip any weight from whatever came next. Rowan placed his ruler against the mark and explained the 2-inch deviation in plain, unhurried language. Victoria looked at the enormous wing towering above them and laughed, asking whether he genuinely intended to delay a $90 million aircraft over a gap shorter than the width of her hand. A few of the surrounding executives laughed along with her, and Graham added that this was the kind of overreaction typical of someone who understood repair work but not large-scale manufacturing. Rowan remained steady, telling her that physics did not change simply because there were cameras rolling. The comment landed harder than he intended, and Victoria, feeling challenged in front of her own people, ordered him to remove the tag immediately. Rowan refused, reminding her that his name was already logged against the inspection. Victoria turned to the quality manager, a nervous man named Nolan Price, and instructed him to reassign the sign-off to someone else. Nolan hesitated, glancing between Victoria and the red tag, before Graham leaned in and murmured something in his ear that made the decision for him. Under obvious pressure, another manager reluctantly signed the release, his pen hovering above the page for a moment too long before he finally committed to it. Victoria herself reached up, peeled the red tag free, and tucked it into the pocket of Rowan's jacket, telling him he needed to learn the difference between real danger and the fear of a man who had simply outlived his usefulness. A few of the reporters lowered their cameras, sensing something worth capturing, though none of them yet understood what they were witnessing. Rowan said nothing in response. He photographed the mark, the serial number, and the time, working with the same unhurried precision he had shown all morning, then filed an emergency report through the internal safety system before Graham pulled him into a side office and threatened to end his contract and blacklist him across the industry. Rowan only asked for written confirmation that leadership had formally dismissed the warning. Graham refused to provide it, a small but telling admission that he did not actually believe the aircraft was safe, and for a moment something flickered across his face that looked almost like guilt before it hardened back into irritation. When Rowan returned to his terminal minutes later, his emergency report had vanished from the system entirely, the log showing no trace it had ever been filed. He sat for a long moment staring at the empty screen, less surprised than he expected to be. Somewhere in the building, a decision had already been made about how far this could be allowed to go, and Rowan understood that whoever made it had no intention of letting a technician's photographs stand in the way of a scheduled celebration. He backed up every photograph, every measurement, and every system log onto a private drive before heading down to the old technical archive beneath the production floor, a room most employees had forgotten existed, its shelves lined with binders nobody had opened in years and a single flickering fluorescent light that buzzed overhead. Dust rose from the boxes as he searched, and for a moment the years seemed to fold back on themselves, the smell of old paper and machine oil pulling him toward memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. There he found the original calibration manual for the very first generation of the Vantage line, a manual that required a direct mechanical check of the reference mark before software was permitted to apply any compensation. That step no longer existed in current procedure. He ran his thumb along the edge of the binding, recognizing the handwriting in the margins before he even turned to the signature page. Digging further, Rowan discovered the newer version had been approved by Graham Lockridge himself under a production acceleration initiative, with the mechanical check dismissed in the paperwork as redundant and unnecessary, a single line buried on page 40 that had quietly erased years of careful engineering. He brought his findings to Dr. Everett Sloan, the chief engineer, a capable man who had grown cautious after years of watching outspoken colleagues lose their positions for raising uncomfortable questions. Everett studied the data with visible discomfort, adjusting his glasses twice as though the numbers might change if he looked at them differently. But he hesitated to draw a conclusion, insisting the simulations still showed an acceptable safety margin. Rowan pointed out that those simulations relied on sensor data already adjusted by the same software that was hiding the mechanical problem in the first place, which meant the numbers were, in effect, lying to themselves. Everett rubbed his temples and admitted quietly that he had never considered the compensation loop from that angle before. Everett wavered but still urged patience, asking Rowan not to escalate further without additional evidence, glancing nervously toward the door as though Graham might already be listening. Rowan asked how much evidence anyone needed when hundreds of passengers would soon be boarding these aircraft, his tone still calm but firmer than before. Checking a second plane undergoing maintenance nearby, Rowan found a similar deviation, smaller but unmistakably present, the same red line sitting just shy of its mark, proof the flaw was not isolated to a single airframe. He photographed this one too, cataloging it alongside the first with the same methodical care, building a record no one would later be able to dismiss as a single unfortunate coincidence. Before he could dig deeper, Graham had security revoke his access badge, citing unauthorized use of archived records, and 2 guards arrived at the archive door within minutes, moving with the kind of speed that suggested the order had come from somewhere far above the security desk. Rowan was escorted out of the building without incident, walking calmly past confused coworkers who had no idea why a technician was suddenly being removed from the premises. Before the guards reached the parking lot, he quietly sent a copy of his findings to the safety division of the airline, scheduled to receive aircraft number 600, a decision he made without hesitation, understanding that some doors closed faster than others, and that this one might not stay open much longer. Meanwhile, veteran test pilot Grant Ellison prepared the same aircraft for a planned demonstration flight, the pre-flight checks reading normal until, during a final slat cycle test, a load indicator spiked and vanished just as quickly. The ground crew dismissed it as sensor noise. Grant remembered an anonymous message he had received earlier that morning, containing a single photograph of a red calibration line sitting 2 inches out of place. Grant halted the taxi immediately, his voice flat and certain over the radio, refusing to let the ground crew simply reset the warning and continue as if nothing had occurred. Years of flying had taught him that the moment a system disagreed with itself was never the moment to trust the more convenient explanation. The demonstration flight was canceled in front of assembled clients and reporters, an embarrassment Victoria took personally as her carefully staged event collapsed around her. In real time, the banners overhead suddenly looking absurd against the empty runway. Graham pushed the communications team to describe the incident as a minor ground sensor malfunction, but Grant refused to sign any report that minimized what he had witnessed, telling his supervisor plainly that his name would not be attached to a lie. When technicians pulled back the access panel, they found the left actuator running noticeably hotter than the right, a detail Victoria brushed aside as the natural result of repeated system testing. Standing outside the gates after his badge was revoked, Rowan received a call from Grant, who wanted to know how a grounded technician could have possibly predicted exactly where to look. There was suspicion in his voice at first, the kind any professional might carry toward an anonymous tip, but it softened as Rowan spoke. Rowan walked him through measuring the distance between the two mechanical reference points, describing each step with the patience of a man who had done it 1,000 times before, and the result matched precisely: 2 inches. Grant sent over the photographs and load data, and Rowan compared them against the second aircraft, confirming the same pattern of deviation across both, the numbers lining up with an exactness that left no room for coincidence. Together, they forwarded everything to Federal Aviation investigators, a move Graham discovered almost immediately after realizing Grant had been in contact with Rowan. He stormed into the Flight Operations Office and threatened to remove Grant from the flight test program entirely, accusing him of undermining the company during its most important week of the year. Grant did not back down, telling Graham flatly that his job was to fly the aircraft safely, not to protect a delivery schedule. At a hastily arranged press briefing held in a side room away from the main hangar, Victoria announced the delay was simply the result of a sensor requiring recalibration, denying that any formal safety warning had ever been issued, her tone smooth and rehearsed despite the tension visible in her shoulders. A reporter pressed her about the red tag seen earlier in the hangar, and Victoria denied its existence outright, unaware that footage of the entire exchange, including her own dismissive laughter about the 2-inch gap, was already circulating publicly among airline employees who had witnessed it firsthand. Company shares dipped slightly, though Victoria remained confident her communications team could contain the story before it grew any larger. That evening, Rowan received a brief call from Tessa, who could tell something weighed on him even though he offered no details beyond the possibility of losing his job. She reminded him of something he had taught her years earlier, sitting at their kitchen table over a broken bicycle gauge when she was still a child, that an incorrect measurement did not become correct simply because the person taking it held a higher title. Not long after the call ended, an airline based in Seattle reported a strikingly similar warning that had occurred 3 weeks prior, one that had been quietly filed away as a software glitch by a maintenance crew who had no reason to question the explanation at the time. That aircraft belonged to the very same serial number range, and when Rowan pulled up its maintenance history, the pattern was unmistakable: the same fixture, the same missing inspection step, the same quiet compensation working overtime beneath a wing nobody had thought to measure by hand. Within the hour, a second carrier reported an identical fault code, proof the problem had already spread far beyond the walls of the Ashbourne factory. Federal investigator Maren Caldwell was assigned to lead an emergency inquiry, and she immediately requested full production data for every aircraft built using the J-17 fixture. Graham insisted the fixture had only touched a small handful of recent builds, but Rowan supplied a complete manifest proving otherwise: 200 aircraft in total. Maren cross-checked the serial numbers herself and confirmed Rowan's figures were accurate down to the last unit. Within hours, federal authorities issued an emergency grounding order covering all 200 Vantage aircraft between serial numbers 401 and 600. Planes still on the ground were barred from taking off, while those already airborne were cleared to complete their current flights before mandatory inspection. No accident occurred and no passenger was harmed, yet hundreds of flights across the country were disrupted, and airline partners began applying enormous pressure on Ashbourne Aeronautics to explain what had gone wrong. Victoria stood in the operations center and watched a map of the country fill with red icons where blue ones had been only minutes earlier, each dot representing another grounded aircraft, another flight crew rerouted, another airline executive already reaching for the phone. Her earlier dismissal, reduced to the phrase "just 2 inches," was now a headline across national news outlets, repeated in tones ranging from disbelief to open ridicule. The board convened an emergency session behind closed doors, and Victoria attempted to redirect blame toward Rowan, suggesting he had exaggerated the danger out of resentment over his suspension, a theory that gained little traction once the federal data began arriving. Graham went further, hinting that Rowan may have tampered with equipment himself, a claim so thin that even some of his own allies exchanged uneasy glances. Rowan was summoned back to the facility for questioning, but denied access to the engineering wing, and in full view of employees gathered in the lobby, security escorted him out a second time, his footsteps echoing across the polished floor, while dozens of eyes followed him in silence. He offered no resistance, walking with the same unhurried calm he had carried since the morning began. Before leaving, he placed a sealed envelope on Marin's desk containing photographs, system logs, the original calibration manual, and clear evidence that his emergency report had been deliberately deleted. Victoria mocked the outdated paperwork, suggesting he was trying to inflate his own importance through old documents nobody cared about, though her voice carried less certainty than it had that morning. Marin asked Victoria a simple question, whether she knew who had written the original calibration procedure for the aircraft in the first place. Victoria answered that it was irrelevant. Marin turned to the final page of the manual and read the name printed at the bottom, Rowan Hale, Senior Flight Control Integration Engineer, the very procedure the federal government had once required as a condition of the aircraft's original certification. For the first time, Victoria had nothing to say. Rowan explained quietly that he had never mentioned his past to claim special treatment. He only wanted every one of the 200 aircraft measured properly. Marin ordered the J-17 fixture and the entire quality control database sealed for further investigation, and she informed the room that the next meeting would take place not in a hangar, but before the full board of directors, federal attorneys, and representatives from 14 airlines. That meeting was held in the highest conference room of Ashbourne's headquarters, beneath a mural celebrating 3 generations of the Ashbourne family name, the portraits watching over the table like silent shareholders in whatever verdict was about to be reached. Rowan was given a small chair near the back of the room, a placement clearly meant to diminish him, though he sat in it without complaint, his ruler resting on the table in front of him like a piece of evidence waiting to be called. Victoria opened by arguing that grounding 200 aircraft was an overreaction, since no accident had actually occurred, her voice carrying the same confidence it always had, though it no longer filled the room the way it once did. Rowan replied that aviation safety existed precisely to prevent accidents, not to wait for casualties before responding, a line that landed with more weight than any of the charts prepared by the legal team. When she challenged him to prove what 2 inches could possibly cause, he placed a small mechanical model on the table and walked the room through exactly how the compensating software made both wings appear synchronized on screen, while one side silently carried far greater strain. He spoke slowly, deliberately, using no more technical language than necessary, aware that half the room had no engineering background at all. Over hundreds of takeoff and landing cycles, that gap would only widen, and under certain conditions of cold temperature or crosswind, the system could reach the limit of its own compensation, causing one slat to extend slower than the other during a critical phase of flight. A hush fell over the table as the implications settled in. Grant Ellison confirmed that the warning he had witnessed matched Rowan's explanation precisely, adding that in his 20 years of flying, he had never seen a discrepancy resolve itself the way the ground crew had assumed it would that morning. Marin presented findings from 37 aircraft already inspected, revealing that 31 exceeded acceptable tolerance, every single one linked to the same fixture, the data displayed on a large screen at the front of the room in stark, undeniable columns of numbers. Victoria turned to Everett Sloan and demanded he refute Rowan's claims, her voice carrying the last traces of the authority she had walked in with. Instead, Everett looked around the room, at the faces of colleagues he had worked alongside for decades, and admitted Rowan was correct, adding that he had personally warned Graham against removing the mechanical inspection step months earlier during a routine engineering review that had apparently gone nowhere. Graham denied it outright, insisting the conversation had never happened, until Marin produced an internal message in which he stated that skipping the step would save 11 minutes per aircraft and help the company hit its quarterly targets. The message displayed on screen with his own name attached to the timestamp. A second message instructed the quality team not to create additional delays over deviations that did not affect appearance, language that drew an audible reaction from several board members hearing it for the first time. Nolan Price, called forward to testify, admitted under questioning that Graham had directly ordered him to delete Rowan's original report, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke, clearly relieved to finally say it aloud after weeks of carrying the secret. Victoria attempted to shift all blame onto Graham, arguing that operational decisions had never crossed her desk. But Rowan reminded the room, calmly and without malice, that she had personally seen the warning, personally mocked it in front of a room full of witnesses, and personally ordered the tag removed with her own hands. There was no message to produce for that moment, no email to project onto the screen, only the memory of everyone who had stood in the hangar that morning and watched it happen. A recording was played on the main screen, capturing her exact words about a washed-up maintenance man's fear, and the room fell into uncomfortable silence. Board Chair Eleanor Wycliffe asked Rowan directly what he wanted from all of this, assuming he might demand compensation, a title, or some form of retribution. Instead, he asked for three things only: a full mechanical inspection of all 200 aircraft, honest public disclosure of the true cause to every affected airline, and a guarantee that no employee would ever be punished for reporting a safety concern. The modesty of the request only deepened Victoria's embarrassment, since it proved beyond doubt that Rowan had never acted out of personal vendetta. The board voted to suspend Victoria's authority over production immediately, and Graham was removed from any further role in the investigation. Marin invited Rowan to join the independent technical team overseeing every repair, a decision met with quiet approval throughout the room. Digging deeper into company archives, Marin discovered that the erasure of Rowan's name from official procedure had not happened recently at all, but years earlier, as part of a much longer pattern of quiet concealment. 8 years before, Rowan had served as the lead integration engineer on the original Vantage program, and during early prototype testing, he had discovered that the flight software was capable of masking small mechanical deviations rather than flagging them. He designed the red reference line and the mandatory direct inspection step himself, a safeguard that helped the aircraft pass its original certification. When his wife became seriously ill, Rowan declined a management promotion to remain available for his family, and after her passing, he stepped away from the company entirely to raise his daughter alone. During his absence, Graham quietly absorbed Rowan's safety procedure into general department practice, stripping his name from training materials until the inspection step was gradually described as an outdated formality rather than a critical safeguard. Victoria, who became CEO afterward, had only ever known the version of history Graham chose to hand her, a fact that did not excuse her behavior, but explained how easily she had trusted a report that favored her own convenience. Investigators later found that Graham's accelerated production bonus program had rewarded him personally for hitting delivery targets, and the 11 minutes saved by skipping inspection had directly contributed to those targets being met, a figure that translated into hundreds of thousands of dollars across 200 aircraft. Graham attempted to negotiate, offering to accept administrative blame if the company would keep the true cause quiet, framing it as a way to protect jobs and shareholder confidence. Rowan refused to support any form of concealment, insisting the deeper problem was never a single dishonest executive, but an entire culture more afraid of slowing the assembly line than of overlooking real danger. He said it plainly to the board that a company could survive a mistake, but it could not survive pretending the mistake never happened. Victoria requested a private meeting with Rowan in a small office overlooking the tarmac, far from the cameras and the mural of her ancestors. She asked why he had never revealed his history as a senior engineer sooner, as though the omission itself explained everything that had gone wrong. He told her plainly that a correct measurement remained correct, whether it came from a chief engineer or a man wiping grease from beneath a wing, and that his old title had never been the point. She asked if he would help frame the crisis publicly as a simple procedural misunderstanding, hoping it might save her position, her voice for the first time sounding less like a chief executive and more like a woman running out of options. Rowan refused again, telling her she had not lost her authority because of 2 inches, but because of the exact moment she chose laughter instead of one more question. Victoria said nothing for a long time after that, staring out at the runway where 2 of the grounded aircraft sat motionless under the afternoon sun. Meanwhile, the technical team pressed forward with inspections and discovered the deviations were not uniform across the fleet. Some aircraft off by barely half an inch, others nearly the full 2, confirming that the flaw involved both the mechanical fixture and the compensating software working together. Correcting the hardware alone would not be enough. Rowan warned the team that rushing aircraft back into service without addressing both layers risked repeating the very failure that had triggered the crisis in the first place, and his caution was quickly validated when the very first aircraft to receive a mechanical repair still failed its follow-up test, proof that a second, deeper layer of concealment remained buried inside the software itself. Rowan was placed in charge of coordinating the independent technical team, made up of representatives from the federal agency, from Ashbourne, and from the affected airlines. He declined an executive office and instead set up his workstation directly inside the hangar, close to the aircraft themselves. Every plane was required to pass through 3 stages: a full mechanical remeasurement, replacement or realignment of the actuator mount, and a complete software update followed by a full cycle test. Rowan split the inspection teams into smaller groups but insisted every result be logged publicly for anyone to review. Though stripped of operational authority, Victoria still offered additional staff to help speed the process, and Rowan accepted the resources while refusing to let her influence inspection standards in any way. Airlines pushed hard for a firm return to service date, but Rowan declined to promise one before the data supported it, telling frustrated executives that the very obsession with deadlines was what had grounded 200 aircraft to begin with. The first 20 aircraft passed inspection cleanly once realignment was complete, and cautious optimism spread through the team, technicians high-fiving in the hangar for the first time since the crisis began. That optimism faded when aircraft number 21, despite a flawless mechanical repair, still returned an abnormal reading. The same warning Grant had first encountered weeks earlier appearing again on a fresh test rig. The room went quiet as engineers exchanged uncertain glances, wondering if the fix they had all believed in was somehow incomplete. Investigating further, Rowan traced the problem to the adaptive software itself, which had spent months quietly learning and storing an incorrect neutral position, a memory that persisted even after the physical hardware had been fixed. He explained it to the team using a simple comparison, that the computer was like a person who had memorized the wrong address so many times that even a new street sign would not change where their feet carried them. Without a full reset and recalibration, the flight computer would continue steering, according to the old, flawed reference point, regardless of what had been repaired underneath. Graham, it turned out, had been warned about exactly this behavior, but delayed the necessary software update because it required additional aircraft downtime, a delay documented in his own scheduling notes. Rowan designed a new reset procedure from scratch, working through 2 long nights with a small group of engineers who trusted his instincts more than they trusted the original documentation. Grant flew the very first test flight following the corrected update, reporting flawless performance throughout, his voice over the radio carrying a note of relief that the entire hangar seemed to share at once. Team after team began working through the grounded fleet in coordinated waves, Rowan running on minimal rest but never isolating himself from the crews doing the physical work alongside him, often kneeling under a wing beside technicians half his age, sharing coffee from the same battered thermos. Watching from a distance, Victoria noticed something she had never fully understood before: the difference between authority granted by a title and trust earned through consistent action. A lesson that arrived far later than she would have liked. Just as the team prepared to announce a viable path forward for the entire fleet, Marin obtained evidence that Graham had been aware of the software risk for at least 6 months prior to the crisis, buried in a maintenance forecast he had personally reviewed and never escalated. A public hearing followed, drawing federal regulators, board members, and airline representatives into a single room paneled with dark wood and lined with cameras from national outlets, the same cameras that had once been aimed at a celebration, now aimed at an accounting. Graham attempted to claim his internal messages had been misunderstood, his lawyer beside him offering careful phrasing about context and intent, but Marin laid out a precise timeline with the patience of someone who had built cases like this before. The first software warning, Graham's decision to delay the update, the removal of the mechanical inspection step, the deletion of Rowan's report, and finally, Victoria's direct approval to continue the delivery ceremony, despite the visible red tag. Every point in the timeline was supported by a document, a timestamp, or a witness, leaving Graham's lawyer with fewer and fewer objections as the hearing wore on. Everett Sloan accepted responsibility for staying silent despite recognizing the danger, his voice unsteady as he addressed the room, resigning his position as chief engineer without attempting to shift blame elsewhere. He said only that he had spent 30 years building a career on caution, and in the one moment that caution mattered most, he had chosen comfort instead. Graham was terminated immediately, his file forwarded to authorities investigating deliberate falsification of safety documentation, and he left the hearing room without meeting anyone's eyes, his once confident stride reduced to something smaller and quieter. Standing before the assembled crowd, Victoria had initially been handed a prepared statement blaming procedural failures and lower-level staff, the kind of carefully worded document designed to survive a news cycle without admitting anything meaningful. She glanced toward the back of the room, where Rowan sat quietly, his expression unreadable, and after a long pause she set the statement aside on the podium in front of her. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began speaking without notes for the first time all week. She admitted, in her own words, that she had seen the warning, mocked it publicly, and allowed pride and financial pressure to override her judgment, describing the moment in the hangar in detail rather than glossing over it the way her lawyers had advised. She repeated the exact phrase she had once used to humiliate him, the fear of a man who had outlived his usefulness, and acknowledged it had been entirely wrong, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. Victoria announced her resignation as chief executive on the spot, and the board accepted it without hesitation, several members visibly relieved that the decision had finally been made for them. Rowan showed no satisfaction in the moment, sitting with the same stillness he had carried since the first morning in the hangar, and his composure only made the reversal land with greater weight across the room. Federal regulators confirmed the repair protocol met every required standard, and the grounding order was lifted in stages as each aircraft completed its full inspection, with no plane cleared for service based on the company's word alone. Airlines demanded compensation but continued their partnership with Ashbourne once the transparent repair process became clear. Several executives later admitting privately that the company's honesty afterward had rebuilt more trust than its reputation ever had before the crisis. Rowan was formally credited as the person who first identified the flaw. His name entered into the federal investigation record alongside every measurement he had taken that first morning. His original safety procedure was restored to company records under his full name, the outdated label removed and replaced with a note crediting the very engineer whose work had once been quietly erased. Footage of Victoria's dismissive laughter now circulated alongside images of 200 grounded aircraft, an unmistakable contrast that spoke for itself without any further commentary needed. The board offered Rowan a senior executive position, but his answer surprised everyone in the room. He declined the title of Vice President of Operations, unwilling to become part of the very power structure that had allowed the crisis to happen in the first place, telling the assembled directors that titles had never been what kept airplanes in the sky. Instead, he agreed to lead a newly created independent safety division, one with the authority to halt any production line without requiring approval from the chief executive, a structural change the board approved unanimously in the wake of everything that had happened. Every employee gained a direct channel to report concerns, protected from retaliation of any kind, with Rowan personally reviewing the first wave of reports that came through in the weeks after the new system launched. 6 months later, all 200 aircraft had completed repairs and returned safely to regular service, each one carrying a fresh red calibration line inspected under the new protocol before its wheels ever left the ground. Ashbourne Aeronautics absorbed significant financial losses but did not collapse, choosing instead to rebuild its reputation through transparent public inspection data rather than expensive publicity campaigns, publishing every safety report in full rather than issuing curated summaries. Rowan continued wearing his technician's uniform and still spent most days down in the hangar rather than behind a desk, insisting that a safety officer who never touched an aircraft would eventually forget what the warnings actually meant. Tessa attended a small ceremony marking the rollout of the new safety protocol, now fully grown and focused on her own engineering studies, her presence brief but meaningful as Rowan introduced her to a few colleagues before returning to his work. Victoria returned to the hangar months later, arriving without an entourage or a single camera trailing behind her. She apologized to Rowan directly, without excuses or qualifications. He accepted the apology, but made clear that responsibility did not simply end because someone had left their position. Looking at the freshly painted red calibration line on a nearby actuator, Victoria admitted she had once believed 2 inches were far too small to matter. Rowan told her that in engineering, 2 inches could be the distance between safety and disaster, and in leadership it was the distance between bending down to check something and turning away from it entirely. She left the hangar without another word. Not long after, a young technician noticed a mark that looked slightly off and called Rowan over immediately, her voice carrying none of the hesitation the younger technician on that very first morning had shown months earlier. The entire line paused without complaint or hesitation, no one rushing him, no one questioning the delay, the culture of the hangar having shifted in ways that no longer needed explaining. Supervisors who might once have pushed for a faster signature instead stepped back and waited, understanding now that a few extra minutes spent checking a mark was never the true cost of doing the work properly. Rowan set his old steel ruler against the mark while the rest of the team stood quietly behind him, waiting for the result together, the way a crew waits on the outcome of something that matters to all of them equally. He measured slowly, the way he always had, unbothered by the eyes on his back or the silence filling the hangar around him. The mark came back with intolerance, a false alarm this time, but nobody treated the pause as wasted time. The young technician exhaled and thanked him, and Rowan simply nodded, already turning his attention to the next aircraft waiting its turn down the line. The hangar lights caught the edge of that worn ruler one final time, closing on the quiet truth that the most dangerous error was never really in the machine. But in the moment, someone with power decided they no longer needed to listen.
Abdul, thank you for the follow. Ruben V, thank you for the follow. Oh, you're good, Nick. You're totally okay. I miss it. Genuinely trust. He's gone, LOL. No one will tell you to stop panic dodging. Okay. I'm gonna keep doing it, bro. Oh yeah, you're right. Increases sprint speed too. You show him you got motion. True. How you doing, Spindle? Welcome in, brother. How's your day going? Adam got motion for sure. I have light motion, I'd say. Moderate motion. How much did I got? Oh, bro, cheat code. Yo, I never seen someone do that before. There we go. Oh shit.